5 3 9 7 1 5.
Hello, and welcome to Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts,
Samantha Carter
and Sarah Jones. We're back yet again to bring you another part of the crazy conspiracy-laden short series that is the Kennedy-era Camelot. Don't forget to press the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you might be listening from, and please go ahead and leave a rating and a review for us because we love hearing from you. If you have a show suggestion or just want to reach out and say hey, you can do so by leaving us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, or you can leave us a text or a voicemail at 641-812-2635, and we'll play it on the next episode. I want to go ahead and apologize as well for my voice because I am sick, not with the COVID.
We have been struggling with illness for the last few weeks.
Yeah, we have. Pretty much everybody. So,
we got a couple of new reviews this week and a couple of really nice comments. One person was pretty happy about the fact that we don't make our show super political, but I do know that we have made a few comments over the past year in a couple of shows that did show a little bias, but in our defense, those were somewhat political shows to begin with. Overall, we do try to keep all of that stuff out of the show and stick to what we're good at talking about. I think we're good at talking about politics.
Yeah, we are. Now on to our episode about politics.
We appreciate that you appreciate that we don't talk about argumentative politics.
We try to appreciate other people's point of views out loud.
And be respectful.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Another comment from Lauren reads, possibly my favorite podcast. These ladies discuss fun and exciting folklore topics and interesting events. I love how they report and dissect them from all angles with facts, humor, and sometimes their view and opinion. Keep up the awesome work. We want to say thank you very much to Lauren for that very nice review.
And we got another review from December. Actually, it was on Christmas Day. And if you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you've already seen that we did a blind reaction video to this review. The person didn't leave their name, but they did give us 4 stars. So I don't think that it was meant to be a bad review necessarily. We're definitely taking it as a win, but it does remind me of getting a compliment from someone who never doles out compliments. So when they do, they try not to make it too nice.
He really struggled to give it to us.
So this one is really freaking great, and we both laughed about it so hard. So the review is this. Yeah, they don't pronounce words good. And yeah, they're not super worldly. They are easy listening. I like the topics, and they don't laugh so loud that I can't fall asleep. If you like paranormal stuff, you could do worse to pass out to. Like, we were dying.
Dying.
It
was great.
Is this nice?
Or no?
Either way, we do appreciate you listening and leaving a review for us. So thank you so much for your review, and we hope you will continue to pass out to our show every night, or at least once a week.
Yeah, once a week-ish.
We'll take it.
We'll take it. We also want to thank our newest Patreon supporter, Lisa. I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's Aiello. Lisa has been a listener for quite a while now and has been pretty interactive on our Facebook group, which we love. So thank you so much, Lisa, for the support that you are showing for us now and all of the support and interaction that you have given us in the past. We appreciate you tremendously. If anyone else would like to show support for the show, you can donate to our Patreon if you wish. It costs a little bit to keep the show going, and every little bit helps us out a ton. We also got our new merchandise shop up and running, and you can find that on our website, bigfootforbreakfast.com, if you want to check that out.
But on to the important part of the show. The actual show.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show!
Here in Los Angeles, new questions were asked today in the Robert Kennedy case.
Paul Schrade, who was wounded in the 1968 shooting, and his attorney, Vince Bugliosi, produced first a photo of police officers at the scene, then an eyewitness statement to establish the possible existence of a 9th and 10th bullet, unaccounted for by police, and detailing the 8 shots from Sirhan's revolver. Are you in effect saying that there was a conspiracy to conceal the existence of a 9th and possibly a 10th bullet?
The more I get into this case, the more I see things that I do not like. I think you can draw certain inferences from that.
In part 1 of the Kennedy Curse series, we talked about Ted Kennedy and the situation at Chappaquiddick Island. This week, we're going a bit deeper into the conspiracy mess as we talk about his brother, Robert Kennedy. We do realize that we're going out of order in events chronologically, but bear with us. You just can't dive in head first. You got to start with the little conspiracy.
Yeah, even though this turned out to be way bigger than I thought it was. There was a lot, but it all ties into JFK. So we have to end with JFK and like how it all why. We don't say words good. We don't math good. We don't say words good. Anyway, Robert, or Bobby Kennedy, born in 1925, was the 7th of the 9 Kennedy children.
7 of 9.
7 of 9.
Shout out to my Star Trek
All
friends.
the Trekkies. Each one of them were incredible and very accomplished people in their own right. He grew up and attended Milton Academy, and then he went on to serve in the Navy from 1944 to 1946, before attending Harvard University and graduating with a degree in government.
Hopefully they don't decide to revoke his degree.
Well, he was a Democrat.
There is that.
He's good.
I don't know. I still feel like John and Bobby were both more libertarian than Democrat, but they're a little left.
See, there goes our bias. Again, we just can't keep a lid on it. There was just a little bit of bias, just the tip.
I'm a big tipper, just saying.
A few years later, in 1950, he married Ethel Skakel, the daughter of George and Ann Skakel, founder of the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation. Then he got right back to his education at Virginia Law School in 1953. He did some pretty interesting things after this, and we'll briefly go through some of it, even though we can't possibly detail all of his accomplishments in this episode. We do feel like that it is important to get a feel for who he was and what he was capable of. He was a very driven person and always seemed to truly want to do the right thing and make the world better. He became a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and then he spent some time traveling all over the world as a special correspondent for the Boston Post.
When Bobby's brother John F. Kennedy decided to throw his hat in the ring for the spot of Massachusetts Senator, Bobby helped campaign like crazy. After that was all over, Bobby went on to do his own thing for a while and ended up serving as part of a Senate subcommittee on investigations. The chair of this subcommittee was a guy named Joseph McCarthy. Fun fact, when you hear people talking politics and they mention McCarthyism, this is the guy, Joseph McCarthy.
It all began with him.
And McCarthyism is basically the act of accusing someone of being treasonous or being communist with no evidence to back up the allegation. Whoa!
We've heard a lot of that term lately.
What?
Can't imagine.
Apparently, during the Cold War, he was a big part of hyping up any scares of Soviet spying that weren't always accurate. Anywho, Bobby did some investigative work for this subcommittee and figured out that some of the countries who had been allies with the U.S. against communist China had also been supplying China with goods. Super weird, right? This finding and the overzealous nature of McCarthy and his chief deputy trying constantly to tie American foreign policy makers to treason forced him to leave after only 6 months. It sounds like McCarthy was always stirring up drama and looking for problems when there weren't any, and he should have been paying attention to his job. He came back for a short time and wrote a report against McCarthy and his investigation of communists within the United States Army. We all know someone like that. Drama.
Accusatory. I feel like I'm the accusatory one lately. I should just look deep inside myself.
Yeah, you should.
When there's nowhere else to look inward, right?
Right.
Anyway.
When you look into the abyss looks right back at you.
I'm not the abyss.
Oh, I thought I meant to say a bitch, not abyss.
Nah. Oh, that's great. During this time, though, he also served on a rackets committee, and in 1957, he used this time on that committee to go hard after the Teamsters Union. This was no small situation. They had 1.3 million members, and the president of the union was none other than the alleged mobster, Jimmy Hoffa, allegedly. Bobby saw Hoffa as nothing but pure evil, and this made him incredibly dedicated to bringing him down. He caused a great deal of headaches for Hoffa, tying him up in court constantly with investigations and calling him out on his insane corruption. Kennedy would belittle him in court, saying that Hoffa wasn't tough enough to get rid of the corrupt people running the union. And these people he was referring to were pretty much mobsters. Pretty big ones. You can actually look up footage of Kennedy interrogating Hoffa relentlessly, and it's pretty easy to see Robert Kennedy's passionate aggression and the way that he gets under Hoffa's skin. Robert Kennedy made a pretty obvious enemy here. He would say things to belittle Hoffa, and Hoffa would retort with smart-ass comments about how he just didn't know what Bobby was talking about. These sessions went on for months, constantly, and Bobby called more than 1,500 witnesses against him. Hoffa constantly denied doing anything wrong. Hoffa wasn't the only big mobster Kenny was going after, but he certainly was the most aggressive with him. Either way, he wasn't winning any friends within the mob community in the United States.
Which I find a good thing in a politician.
Yeah, probably best not to run with the mob. And then eventually your government just becomes the mob.
No comment?
Literally.
No comment. Later, when his brother JFK won the presidency, and although it was kind of a controversy at the time, he was appointed to serve as Attorney General for him. Here, he created some more enemies. Some more pretty big ones. Sadly, most of these enemies stemmed from his tireless fight for human rights. Mainly integration, and the right for African Americans to vote in America. Some strong and ruthless people within politics came out against Bobby Kennedy in this fight and were very loud and angry about it.
If there was anything in the world that Bobby Kennedy seemed to hate, it was communism. And he worked incredibly hard against it throughout his entire career in whatever capacity he served. At a time when communism was the #1 enemy in America, he made no qualms with constantly denouncing it. In 1959, the Cuban communist regime became a direct and pretty clear threat to the United States after Fidel Castro forced his way into power. And the Bay of Pigs happened, which was a pretty big embarrassment for the United States. For those who don't know, the Bay of Pigs was basically a plan to train Cuban exiles in military combat and send them to Cuba to overthrow Castro. In 1961, new President JFK authorized the plan, but he wanted to keep the U.S. involvement a secret. The whole plan was pretty strategic, but it depended mostly on the Cuban people having their back. And the U.S. assumed that they would because they seemed to want Castro out of power.
Castro figured out what was going on through his intelligence agents in Miami, so he already knew it was coming. The U.S. sent in an airstrike that consisted of old World War II American planes disguised as Cuban planes and piloted by Cuban exiles. The crash course bombers totally missed their targets and barely even bothered the Cuban Air Force. Photos of the planes became public, and even though the U.S. had painted the planes to look like Cuban planes, it was obvious that they were Americans. U.S. involvement was pretty blatant. They tried a different tactic, sending in newly trained soldiers along the Bay of Pigs, but Castro was prepared. Long story short, our Cuban trainees were totally destroyed, most of them died or were taken prisoner, and Robert Kennedy took the initiative to take care of the mess and try to diminish his brother's involvement in the matter. He traded the prisoners back to the U.S. for $53 million worth of baby food and medicine. Let's just say that Robert didn't make any friends in his dealings with this matter.
Especially since he wasn't done with this matter. He went on to head up a second operation against Castro called Operation Mongoose.
Mongoose.
In which they would attempt to constantly harass Castro, eventually overthrowing him and hopefully kill him. A man named Sam Halpern was in charge of this task force and answered directly to Robert Kennedy. He stated in an American Experience article that they couldn't do enough to please Robert Kennedy. They came up with all sorts of crazy ideas to deal with Castro, but at the end of the day, Bobby Kennedy wanted things blown up, so we blew things up. They tried making Castro sick, riling up a coup within the country, caused him a bunch of headaches, and probably really pissed him off. And I doubt that Castro forgot dealing with Bobby Kennedy. So by now, he's really gotten under the skin of two major power-hungry corrupt organizations, the American Mafia and the Cuban Communist government.
After his brother was brutally assassinated in public in Dallas, Texas, it was stated that Bobby took it especially hard. In an interview for the Netflix series Bobby Kennedy for President, a close associate of Kennedy stated, "When I got to the airport and I looked over in the corner by an old truck, there was somebody walking up and down. I walked over and it was Bobby Kennedy by himself and he was crying. I walked over and said, 'Bob, we're all crying. The world is crying.'" And we're pretty sure that this was the case, and America felt a pretty big blow. While there were plenty of people in the United States who absolutely hated John F. Kennedy, he was making enormous strides in the way of civil rights movements during this time. He was really creating a different mindset and moving people to do what was right in terms of integration and equality. He was never afraid to go into a fight, even if he wasn't sure he was going to win. And his brother Bobby had the same positive ambition that would later serve him well in his own bid for presidency. We all know what the establishment does when people come in and try to shake up the status quo.
After his brother died, of course, it was Lyndon B. Johnson, vice president at the time, who took over the presidency. From the very beginning, it was said that Bobby didn't like Johnson. He never trusted him, and he constantly questioned his brother's decision to put Johnson in that position. Of course, all of this created quite a bit of friction between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, because it was no secret that they never really got along. At one point, Johnson was said to have cornered Kennedy in the kitchen of the Kennedy home, asking what the deal was. Why didn't Robert like him? From the article we read, it was unclear how Robert handled this interaction, but we're guessing it probably didn't go well since their relationship continued to be strained and contentious. Johnson was aware that the Kennedys viewed him as unworthy and called him names behind his back, but Johnson would privately refer to Bobby Kennedy as a little runt. So now, here he was serving as Attorney General to Johnson after his brother had been killed. Once Bobby Kennedy was quoted as saying about Lyndon B. Johnson, "Our president," speaking about his brother, "was a gentleman, a human being. This man's not. He's a mean, bitter, vicious animal in many ways. I think he's got this other side of him in his relationship with human beings that's got to make it very difficult unless you want to kiss his behind all the time."
So it sounds like he and Johnston constantly disagreed. Johnson would bark unreasonable orders at him, and Robert Kennedy would be intentionally dismissive, even laughing him off at times, which enraged LBJ. When the U.S. remained deeply in the conflict in Vietnam, LBJ would go on the television to defend the decision, and Bobby stayed quiet about it at first, even mildly defended it. But it wasn't long before he began to publicly speak out against it. And Lyndon B. Johnson became more determined to win the war, even though Bobby felt it wasn't going to happen and that we needed to stop sending troops. It was an unwinnable war that was none of our business. Instead of pulling our troops out of the war, though, LBJ raised the draft call.
In an article for American Experience, they wrote about a disagreement between LBJ and Bobby. Apparently, LBJ wanted a Democratic National Committee member taken out of his position. At this time, that particular National Committee member, John Corbin of New Hampshire, happened to be trying very hard to get people to write in Bobby Kennedy for president in the upcoming 1964 election. And of course, LBJ would be running for president and wanted to be the one on the Democratic ticket. At this point, Bobby had announced no plans to even run for presidency. LBJ walked into Bobby's office and demanded that Bobby get rid of the committee member. Bobby refused to get involved. Corbin had been appointed by his brother, and it was not Bobby's responsibility. He pretty much laughed in LBJ's face, telling him to take care of it himself. LBJ reiterated to Bobby that he was to do what he said, and even went as far as to say, "President Kennedy isn't the president anymore. I am." These words likely hit Bobby Kennedy like a ton of soul-crushing bricks.
Bobby, not liking Johnson, his policies, and his decisions was probably a thorn in Johnson's side all along the way. Bobby was Attorney General and was very, very outspoken and driven. But LBJ wasn't the only person who had a problem with Bobby Kennedy. An article for the Herald of Freedom written in 1967 titled J. Edgar Hoover versus Robert F. Kennedy said a lot of horrible things about Bobby, calling him devious and referring to him as a pipsqueak turned attorney general, and talking about how he was politically ambitious, but that the rest of his family was much better than him at politics. They basically made it sound like he demanded the position of Attorney General under his brother John F. Kennedy and accused him of using eavesdropping devices in illegal investigations that the FBI wanted no part of. They cited this reason, among others, that there was a lot of bad blood between he and the FBI director J. Edgar Hoover. They accused him of putting the blame on Hoover when he supposedly was caught bugging people when he wasn't supposed to be in order to save political face. The article even talked about Bobby having an affair with the late Marilyn Monroe and his wife, Ethel, threatening divorce. It was pretty smeary.
The author of the article goes on to talk about the Marilyn Monroe case. He made allegations that tapes had been obtained during raids for illegal buggings that included a conversation between Robert Kennedy and two other men talking about the Marilyn Monroe death. He also alleges that, strangely, Maryland's press secretary, Patricia Newcomb, was immediately flown to the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport, and then to Europe after the death of the actress. And then she was put on the government payroll when she got back after the Marilyn Monroe investigation had wrapped up. Not only that, she was given an office right next to Robert Kennedy. In what capacity she was employed, we're not sure, but they made sure to make it sound really bad. And just so you know, we have a whole other episode coming up on Marilyn Monroe's very suspicious demise as well.
But that's not the end. The writer goes on to make even more allegations against Robert Kennedy. He wrote about more illegal wiretapping that was happening under the direction of Kennedy in regard to the Jimmy Hoffa investigations that he headed up, as well as jury intimidation and bribery. He blames all of this misconduct on Kennedy's personal vendetta against Hoffa.
Now, this article was written a long time ago, and it's very long and incredibly hateful. We're not sure how credible it is, because if you read it, it sounds very emotionally charged. The point is, he had some enemies and some accusations. We don't know if Bobby Kennedy was illegally wiretapping people or not. It kind of sounds like he was. The dive that we took into the FBI files was interesting. There were documents after documents that show that the FBI was keeping a very close eye on every move Bobby Kennedy made, and they often talked about the wiretapping. In regards to FBI involvement, though, J. Edgar Hoover's responses seemed much more like he wanted the FBI to appear not to be involved. He never actually seemed to say that they weren't, though. It kind of makes a person wonder if the FBI wasn't just placing the blame on Kennedy in his position as Attorney General when the wiretapping allegations started coming out.
The FBI would never do that.
Especially not J. Edgar Hoover. They spent a lot of time pointing fingers at each other. There were several documents in which a member of the press would write to J. Edgar Hoover about Kennedy's wiretapping, and Hoover would usually respond with a letter indicating, but not outright saying, that they should run a story to make it sound like it was Bobby and just to leave the FBI's name out of it.
Speaking of his disagreements with J. Edgar Hoover, like we said, it doesn't take much digging into the FOIA FBI declassified files to show that the FBI had been closely keeping an eye on Bobby Kennedy. There are documents in there about how he helped Martin Luther King, things he did for MLK's family after he'd been assassinated. They talked about Bobby Kennedy trying to buy the primaries in Indiana by paying college students to hustle up votes, spending $750,000. There were also several documents simply informing J. Edgar Hoover of where Robert Kennedy was and who else of interest would be in that area in conjunction with Bobby, namely Stokely Carmichael, another major civil rights activist. There was a document informing Hoover that Robert Kennedy was receiving campaign donations from the Lilly Foundation, which was an organization to help troubled youth of color. These are just a couple of examples of the FBI's obvious interest and following of Robert Kennedy and his association with the civil rights activists and organizations. There were even a few documents in this in which members of the FBI corresponded about how they could use information that they collected to leak and embarrass Robert Kennedy. Seriously, there were a lot of documents in which members of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, expressed great distrust and dislike for Kennedy. Ironically, though, we also found a very nice letter from J. Edgar Hoover to Ethel Kennedy after Bobby's death, expressing his profound sadness over the tragic loss of her husband, in which they offered their deepest sympathy to her and her children. He expressed that Kennedy's passing leaves a great void in the hearts of the entire nation. So that was nice.
Only 1 year later, though, on November 16th of 1970, J. Edgar Hoover did an interview in which he talked a lot of crap about RFK, stating that there was only one attorney general worse than Bobby, and that was Ramsey Clark. Our point is, not only was Bobby making plenty of waves and trouble for communist organizations, white supremacy groups, and the mob, he had enemies on his own team. LBJ was pretty annoyed by Bobby constantly overstepping and defying him, and J. Edgar Hoover constantly expressed great dislike and distrust for him as well.
Through all of Bobby Kennedy's civil rights work and the ways he helped the movement and the support that he gave Martin Luther King, there were also reasons to think that Kennedy was also employing a, quote, keep your friends close and your enemies closer strategy here. Reading through all of the FBI files also gave the impression that Kennedy actually was bugging Martin Luther King, and he was having people watch him and report back to him who MLK was associating with out of concern for his activities related to national security. Kennedy was in a position to do this as Attorney General, so was he doing it out of duty while simultaneously genuinely supporting him? Or did he have actual suspicions that MLK was up to no good? Some of these documents seem to genuinely indicate that Kennedy might have thought MLK was communicating with known communists and Marxists, but there were a lot of things said about Kennedy in these papers that didn't seem to be true. We just thought that it was worth noting that they were talking about it.
Reading through all of these things was crazy. It genuinely sounds like a huge group of political frenemies, all trying to meet their agendas while trying not to be shown in a bad light by the press and using each other's resources and platforms strategically while betraying each other behind their backs. Government and politics are tumultuous. But we already knew that.
But there were many American people who really loved Bobby, and he had been questioned many times whether or not he would be willing to run for New York Senate. It seems as though there were lots and lots of people who wanted him there. In a couple of press conferences that we watched, he seemed baffled a little bit by this because he wasn't even a resident of New York. In one conference, he was telling a reporter that he wasn't really sure what he had planned for his life. He kind of wanted to teach, he kind of wanted to be a writer, and he kind of just wanted to go away for a while. He also expressed that he thought it would be in New York's best interest maybe for someone who actually lived there in New York to serve in this position.
But something must have changed along the way, because in the next race for the New York Senate, Bobby Kennedy took up residence there, and he seemed to be an easy Democratic nomination to run against Republican Kenneth Keating. It was a tough race, since Kennedy was labeled a carpetbagger from the start, but Bobby kept his humor. Fun fact, a carpetbagger was a common term for politicians who presumptuously seek positions or success in a new locality. Lots of people liked him, but lots of people felt that he didn't belong there too. He made comments to reporters like, quote, "I have really had two choices over the period of the last 10 months. I could have stayed in, I could have retired, and my father's done very well for himself and I could have lived off of him. I tell you frankly, I don't need this title because I could be called general, I understand, for the rest of my life. And I don't need the money, and I don't need the office space." End quote. He just wanted to serve the people, and many of them had asked him to do so. Long story short, he was such a caring and empathetic person that he won the election and became senator of New York in 1964.
He served his term here successfully, constantly fighting for better living and working conditions for others. He fought against the extreme poverty that was seen all over the nation and beyond. He went to Delano, California to break bread with Cesar Chavez, ending a 25-day hunger strike in their fight for the conditions of migrant workers. He forced better working conditions and better pay in some areas and encouraged industrial development in others to create jobs. He advocated for work over welfare and tried to help people help themselves. He even made some enemies doing this because, of course, some bigwigs lost out on some money when they were forced to make things a little more fair.
He went on to run for the presidency in 1968. LBJ had decided, for whatever reason, not to seek a second term, and Bobby Kennedy was looking incredibly promising for the Democratic pick to run against President Nixon. That next year, he spent campaigning. He delivered speeches all over the U.S. and made incredible strides in uniting the country. He promoted hope, fairness, prosperity. People loved him, as they had loved his brother. The murder of JFK was a dismal time in American history. Morale had been low, and it felt like it was the end of the subtle rise against the establishment. RFK's campaign renewed every ounce of American hope that they felt had been quashed.
On June 5th of 1968, 5 months before the election, Bobby Kennedy had been holding his breath all day in Los Angeles waiting to see if he would win the Democratic primary for the state of California. This was going to be, obviously, a big win, and he finally got word that he had indeed come out on top. He had won the Democratic primary in California, and this was huge. There was a celebration at the Ambassador Hotel in LA, where Kennedy had given an emphatic victory speech to approximately 1,800 guests who were there celebrating the win. The speech ended with Kennedy shouting, "Now on to Chicago, and let's win there." Morale was high and everyone was absolutely elated. Finally, it was time to go home, and he and his wife Ethel were ending the night. It was time to say their goodbyes and their thank yous and go home. They passed through the ballroom, chatting with the people who were still celebrating his victory, signing autographs and kissing babies. Just as previously planned, surrounded by heavy security, they exited the ballroom through the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
Now, a kitchen pantry sounds like a small place, but to see videos and photos, it looked like a rather large room. He was shaking hands and chit-chatting with the kitchen staff as he was gently being led along by security guards. Saying hello and talking with everyone he passed sounds like it was pretty common for his personality. On the way out, he walked up to a man from Palestine by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. The man stood in front of Robert Kennedy and in front of everybody present, blatantly pulled a .22 revolver and began to fire.
No one was expecting this, and it seems that it took people a few seconds to realize what was even happening. It caught them off guard. It was just previously a jovial and innocuous moment in which they were simply trying to leave a party, a time when everyone was happy and a risk of danger seemed to be low. An environment full of people celebrating what was to come. When it became clear what was happening, instantly, people started dogpiling on top of the gunman as he continued to pull the trigger in his 8-shot .22 revolver until it was empty, hitting 6 people altogether. Paul Schrade, a speechwriter, had been hit directly in the forehead and was at first presumed dead. Erwin Stroll was 17 years old and was hit in the left leg. William Weissel was an ABC director who was hit in the abdomen. Ira Goldstein was a reporter who was shot in the hip. Elizabeth Evans was an artist who was luckily only grazed by a bullet on the forehead.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
At the end of the commotion, it appeared Robert F. Kennedy was shot 3 times. Once in the right armpit, another directly below that, about 1.5 inches, and a third bullet hole was noted just below his right ear. He was rushed immediately to the hospital. There are heartbreaking photos from the moments after Kennedy was shot in which he appears to be awake, with his wife dutifully at his side trying to comfort him. It was said that some rosary beads were placed into his hand as he lay on the floor by a busboy named Juan Romero. And as he did this, Kennedy asked in a whisper, "Is everyone all right?" He died from his wounds approximately 24 hours after arriving to the hospital. America and its great fight for the rights of humans, a fight that seemed to be gaining traction with leaders who were making progress. The hope of the people had once again been completely annihilated, as they had now lost both Robert F. Kennedy and the great Martin Luther King within 2 months of each other.
Later on in the day, Leo caught up with Chief Ed Davis, and Davis, as he has all along, flatly rejects the idea of a police conspiracy to suppress evidence in the entire Kennedy case. The chief again assures Sirhan the only assassin.
We're going to hear about theory, conspiracy on this thing forever, probably. And then when they get through with that, they'll probably be out to release John Wilkes Booth.
Just the second gun theory in the Kennedy assassination just won't go away.
The credibility of those reports of a 9th and a 10th bullet may have to be settled in court. Also to be resolved is the question of why the police did not keep some critical items of evidence in such an important case.
The gunman, Sirhan Sirhan, was indicted by the grand jury of LA County and charged with the first-degree murder of Robert Kennedy and for assault with a deadly weapon with intent to commit murder of Paul Schrade, Owen Stroll, William Weissel, Elizabeth Evans, and Ira Goldstein. Sirhan Sirhan and his counsel made a few moves to 1. Try to get the evidence recovered from a search and seizure at his home following the murder suppressed. 2. Quash the indictment altogether. Both of these things were denied pretty quickly, along with several subsequent writs and appeals filed by his attorney. Sirhan Sirhan's attorney even went so far as to file a writ claiming that evidence had been suppressed. There was evidence not heard suggesting that not 1 gun was fired at Senator Bobby Kennedy, but 2. None of this mattered, though, and the trial of Kennedy's alleged murderer went off without a hitch, and the jury wouldn't hear any of that. Sirhan Sirhan was sentenced to death in 1969. And in the prosecution's defense, Sirhan really shot himself in the foot over and over again at trial anyway. It sounds like he was constantly using the publicity to promote his own totally anti-Semitic platform. He was angry at the government and at RFK for taking Israel's side instead of acting on behalf of the Palestinians, and took great pains to express this during the trial.
Now that most of the important backstory has been told, we're going to get into some of the questionable things surrounding RFK's horrible and untimely death. But after the trial, there had been a lot of inquisition surrounding the evidence, the eyewitnesses, versus how the trial ended up. Let's start with some of the things that were found during the search and seizure performed at Sirhan's apartment after the assassination. One of the most forefront items was Sirhan's diary. By its descriptions, it sounds a lot like a book full of rantings from a madman. Scribbled over and over and over again inside of it were things like RFK must die, Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated, along with other phrases that didn't really make any sense. Especially specific was a statement written in the diary that Robert Kennedy had to be assassinated before June 5th of 1968, and he was killed not long after midnight on that very day.
Sirhan claimed from the very beginning that he has zero memory of shooting Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel. It was LSD. He was interviewed on television at one time and did state that he was disappointed in RFK and his support for Israel in the Six-Day War that had happened the year before. He was Palestinian, so this didn't bode well with him. Rumor has it that Sirhan was super obsessed with mystical things. He believed that he was on the verge of being able to control things that would happen with his own mind, and was really particularly enamored with hypnosis. According to an article from the Mary Ferrell Foundation, The Robert Kennedy Assassination, it was stated that he was very easily hypnotized, and it was thought that the strange repetitive nature of the writings were because he wrote in his diary while under hypnosis.
After Robert Kennedy's assassination, obviously the DA's office in LA investigated and issued a report of their findings, just like normal. In the report that was provided by the investigation, Sirhan was named the only gunman on the scene.
Sirhan went on to trial before a jury of his peers in 1969 and was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Robert Kennedy. But for years later, large amounts of pressure had been placed on the California courts to reopen the case and have it re-examined. And the pressure didn't just come from a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Other judges, notable scholars, attorneys, educators, and a lot of credible people wanted this case reopened and reinvestigated by people outside of the regular court system because they believed the whole story wasn't being told. And that's a nice way of putting it. Many believed that the whole story was being hidden.
So this push for a reinvestigation sparked a lot of people to look into the case much further. One in particular was a man named Ted Chirac, and in 1970, only a year after the trial of Sirhan, he produced a documentary on the case and its inconsistencies. Chirac worked with a man named Herbert McDonald, and in a re-examination of the ballistics evidence. In the end, McDonald signed an affidavit stating that per his examination, the original investigation's ballistics report was wrong. He attested that the bullet that was exhibit number 47, this is the one that was shot just under RFK's right ear and lodged in his neck, was not fired from the .22 revolver of Sirhan. He also attested that this bullet was not fired from the same gun as the one that hit William Weissel. Herbert McDonald is a criminologist who served on numerous forensic science boards throughout his years in the field. He invented the Magna brush to dust for fingerprints. He had a master's degree in chemistry from the University of Rhode Island. He served as a professor at Milton College, Corning College, and Elmira College, and he worked for the Consultant Laboratory Forensic Science as well. He wasn't exactly just a schmuck.
Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5, 1968 in the Ambassador Hotel following his victory of the California Democratic presidential primary. He was shot moments after making the victory speech at the embassy ballroom. Kennedy started to walk through a pantry kitchen area. He was fatally wounded in the head and died the following day in a hospital. Sirhan was arrested at the scene, a gun in hand. He was tried and convicted for that crime and is in state prison today.
In 1971, a reporter named Fernando Farah and his lawyer filed an action to obtain full disclosure in the records of RFK's assassination. The investigation and the court records were supposed to be available at this point upon request, so they should have been fairly easy to obtain, but Farah had sent in these requests to the LAPD and had been met with an old-fashioned runaround.
This morning, we filed an action in Superior Court on behalf of my client, Fernando Farah, in an action to initiate full disclosure into the investigation and the records of the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
Mr. Farah was a very credible and reputable investigative reporter with an extensive background. Mr. Farah did want information regarding the case, but what he mostly wanted from the LAPD actually belonged to him. In 1968, Mr. Farah had turned over some tapes to the police that were of evidentiary value. This was supposed to be for recording purposes only to help their investigation, and when he wanted them back, they wouldn't let him have them. After they first straight up said that he couldn't have them, he pushed the issue. Then they began denying that the tapes that he had recorded ever even existed. Then they said that they'd never had them at all. He already felt very strongly that there was a cover-up going on within the police investigation, and this did not help to extinguish that suspicion. During a press conference in 1971, Mr. Farah stated that the tapes consisted of recordings of a local salesman named John Fahey and a woman speaking with each other. Fahey's story was that he had been with a woman on June 4th that he picked up at the Ambassador Hotel. The woman invited the man to come to the Ambassador Hotel to witness the murder of Mr. Kennedy.
Fahey had recorded this conversation, and after the Kennedy murder actually did happen, he held on to the tape until he could decide who to give it to. After a publication had been written and printed about another witness, this witness had been turned over to the police. Fahey was scared of this happening. This was a really high-profile situation, and he didn't want anything to go wrong or to be implicated for something he didn't do. He went to Mr. Farah's office on June 12th, 8 days after the assassination, and he told Farah that he would give him the tape if Farah could offer him protection.
Let's cover all the aspects of the investigation. I have enough documents, both FBI and police documents, to show that this investigation was a fraud. Well, the police have been saying that this was a very thorough investigation in which no stone was left unturned. This is not so. This is sheer fabrication. We can show that the investigation was in fact very sloppy, and we can do that with their own documents. So we're hoping to take this to a grand jury or to court, where we can use their own documents to show that they were very sloppy in that investigation and that every lead that pointed to a conspiracy was shoved under the rug.
After assurance from Farah that he would do the best he could, Fahey did give up the tape. Fahey went on to give Farah a very detailed description of the woman that had invited him to witness RFK's murder, and a composite drawing had been done on her. Mr. Farah then took the composite drawing to show witnesses who were present at the Ambassador Hotel pantry when Kennedy was shot. They didn't tell the witnesses what they were identifying, but simply asked them if they had seen this woman, and she was confirmed by the witnesses to have been there. They figured that the best protection that they could offer him from the police would be to run the story in the press first, so that the story would already be out and they couldn't hide anything or accuse him of anything.
After it had run in the press, the police pretty much refused to acknowledge Mr. Fahey's story at all, according to Mr. Farah. Mr. Farah's office made the witness take a polygraph with one of the best polygraph experts in the country to be sure that all of this was credible, and of course, he passed. It was at that point, after he had already passed the polygraph, that police decided to take him a little more seriously and brought him into their office to speak with him. After doing so, they gave him a polygraph of their own and stated that he failed theirs, once again dismissing him.
When he was asked why the witness didn't just go to the FBI, he said this.
Well, he had already gone to the FBI. He went to the FBI one day after the killing. He went to the FBI on June 6th, as the record will show there. The police told him that they were going to the FBI told him they were going to tell the police, which they didn't. This, of course, was also typical of that investigation. There's more than one witness, with which this happened. By June 12th, he still had not talked to the police when he came to me. It was I, the one that made the arrangements to turn him over to the police. I should have known better, of course.
Farah doesn't offer any explanation as to why the police and the FBI covered up the investigation. He wasn't sure why they did it. He just stated that he knows that they did. Farah mentioned that the Attorney General kept publicly stating that the investigation records were public, but when people would go in to gain access to them, they would never be given to anyone. They were basically faking transparency.
He went on to say that the FBI and the local LA police may have been actively covering up evidence in the case. He then gave an example of a testimonial report regarding one of the witnesses, a Mr. Victor Albert Ellis. The FBI stated that they showed Ellis a picture of Sirhan Sirhan, and he identified Sirhan as the shooter. Later, when Farah spoke with Ellis, he stated to him that he was never even shown a photo in the first place. So why would the FBI report blatantly lie about this? Farah goes on to call the entire investigation a fabrication, a fraud, and extremely sloppy, and states that all of this can be proven with their own documents.
So there are two witnesses, one who was almost completely dismissed for whatever reason, and another whose testimony was falsified. And this is only the start of a long line of such witnesses who had a bad experience with the FBI and LAPD investigators who were working to solve the murder of Robert Kennedy, all of which we can't possibly get in one episode.
In 1974, yet another gentleman looked into the ballistics evidence and re-examined it. He was a retired investigator for the California State Crime Lab, and his name was Lowell Bradford. He also looked over the initial re-examination by the highly credentialed Herbert McDonnell, and agreed with his conclusion and findings that the bullets were different and could not have come from the same weapon.
In 1975, a panel of ballistics experts were appointed and asked by the courts in LA to go over this evidence as well. This would be the third re-examination of the ballistics evidence. The previously mentioned Lowell Bradford served on this panel. They discovered that the bullet evidence was actually seriously mishandled by LAPD. Some of them were switched around from their original labeling, and they even found reason to think that the gun in the evidence wasn't even the actual gun that Sirhan used. Upon searching, it appeared that the original gun checked into evidence as Sirhan's gun had a different serial number than the one used in trial, and they believed that the test gun used in the original ballistics investigation for the trial was actually introduced into evidence as the real gun. What the hell?
Whoops.
This panel also looked at the report from the initial search of Sirhan's car. This report stated that 2 bullets were removed from his car, and that on these bullets they found traces of wood on the bases and on the tip. It doesn't say whether these were new bullets or spent bullets, but in the article regarding the assassination at the Mary Ferrell Foundation website, they do beg the question, were these the bullets dug out of the door frame in the pantry after the shooting? We haven't talked about it yet, but there were supposedly 2 other bullets that had been lodged in a door frame and in a door divider that were later denied having been bullets at all. Yet, there are photos of police officers digging these bullets out of those areas. There are other reports that state that a desk clerk from the hotel was the one who identified those particular bullet holes, and that upon investigation, they were deemed not to be bullet holes at all, but holes caused by wear and tear.
Yeah, I feel like that would have been really obvious right from the very beginning, but I digress.
That's your cause of death right there.
I feel like we would be really good investigators. Keyboard investigators. This was an idea raised many times over the years. Tons of people claim that there were more bullets found lodged around the room in which the shooting occurred than the number of bullets that Sirhan's gun could hold, and he didn't reload. So where did these other bullets come from? The police have always maintained that there were only 8 bullets recovered, and that Sirhan's revolver held 8 shots. So why so much controversy over this?
Again in 1975, special counsel to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, Thomas Kranz, was appointed to independently investigate the assassination of the senator in an attempt to gain a fresh look at the case.
So the first 3 re-examinations were re-examinations of the ballistics, but this new one, Thomas Kranz was asked to do a whole examination of everything, go over all the evidence, all the testimony, and just redo it from a different point of view.
He seemed to be a good candidate to provide this fresh look because he went into the case having previously expressed reservations that he had had with how the case had been handled. He had stated publicly that there were a lot of unanswered questions. He hadn't necessarily felt that Sirhan had been falsely accused, but was more concerned that the Los Angeles system of justice had lost credibility with the public due to their lack of diligence with the witnesses, general refusal to adequately answer legitimate questions, and to quell public unrest about the possible second shooter. He felt that the public largely did not feel confident with the work that they had done, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you that just like JFK, he was killed by the smoking man from the X-Files.
Yeah.
I called it.
I seen it with my own eyes. Cran's report, though, was taking a very long time being released to the public. It wasn't long before rumors and speculation about why this report was taking so long to finish up were abound. It was being circulated that the delay was being caused by last-minute changes made within the report before it would be made available publicly, and people were suspicious of these changes. It seemed that this report would end up blaming most of the supposed need for evidentiary re-examination and the reaction of the public and the media for a more thorough investigation on the simple fact that Robert Kennedy was simply a hoe.
He was a hoe.
Robert Kennedy was simply a high-profile person. So this murder garnered the attention of a much larger crowd than a typical murder. So it was understandable that there would be much more public outcry.
It sounds like there was a little more to it than that, though. There were actually a lot of inconsistencies with eyewitness reports and the coroner examination of the body of Robert Kennedy.
His official report wasn't released at the time, but Special Counsel Thomas Cranz did do an interview in 1975 with Laddie Atterberg of KTTV, in which he speaks of the fact that during his investigation, there was no evidence whatsoever of there being a second gun involved in the shooting of Robert F. Kennedy, and that there was no evidence of Sirhan being involved in a conspiracy involving anyone else within the government, the police, or anywhere. He talks about how there are a lot of people that adamantly disagree with him. During this interview, the interviewer plays a clip from an interview with another man named Ted Chirac. Remember, we talked about him earlier. He was the one who made the documentary on the inconsistencies with the ballistics. Chirac was probably the loudest voice when it came to advocating for the second gun theory. In this clip, Chirac says that there is no possible way that Sirhan was the person who fired the fatal shots that killed Robert Kennedy. Although there is no denying that Sirhan was there. He did draw his weapon and he did fire shots. He states that Sirhan was directly in front of Kennedy the entire time. And remember, he only had 8 shots to fire. The first 5 shots missed Kennedy and hit people who were behind him, and the bullets that killed Kennedy were fired into his back at point-blank range. He claims that there is plenty of photographed evidence that had been collected by the FBI, the police, and the press that show extra bullets lodged in other places within the room. Although now, people were having trouble obtaining this photographic evidence.
The interviewer asks investigator Cranz what he thinks about what Mr. Chirac has to say about the second gun theory and his proof. Cranz responds thoughtfully to this, saying that he has a great deal of respect for Mr. Chirac?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chirac.
Mr. Crack? Mr. Crotch?
A great deal of respect for Mr. Chirac, but the problem with Chirac's theory is that, 1, although Sirhan did approach Kennedy from the front, at the last minute, Kennedy had turned away from Sirhan just before he shot him in order to shake hands with a couple of busboys, which would make the line of fire accurate.
And really, if you see someone walking toward you and pull a gun, what's your first reaction? You're going to turn away. That's not really illogical.
And second, no eyewitnesses came forward in the trial or to the grand jury stating that they saw a second gunman, and the ballistics testimony stated that all of the bullets found at the scene came from one gun that matched Sirhan's .22 revolver. 3. The autopsy done by Dr. Thomas Noguchi states that the range from the muzzle of the gun to Bobby Kennedy was no more than a few inches, so whoever shot him was right next to him. The witnesses in the room at trial put Sirhan a few to several feet away from Kennedy when the shots were fired. Cranz acknowledges that this dispute has been going on since the shooting happened, and that they basically attribute to the witnesses always giving different distances for Sirhan to Kennedy to it just being a chaotic situation. So Cranz does acknowledge that the eyewitness testimony across the board never puts Sirhan that close to Bobby, but the coroner had stated that the fatal shots were definitely at point-blank range. He indicates that since it was such a high-stress, panicky mess, the witnesses likely have it wrong.
As far as the testimony that there were other bullets found at the scene, Cranz states that although he doesn't think there were any other bullets, there really wasn't any good answer, because the pieces of the building the ceiling panels, and the door frames that were taken out of the rooms as evidence that might have contained the bullets, or evidence of the bullets, had by now been destroyed by the LAPD in a move that he called idiotic, because it obviously undermines confidence in the investigations. It sounds like they destroyed these pretty important pieces of evidence not long after their own investigation, so subsequent investigations were just SOL.
During this interview, they go on to discuss the fact that there were 2 guards within that room who both carried a weapon. One of the guards' names was Thane Eugene Caesar, and he carried a .38 revolver, and he did have a .22 revolver registered to him privately, although we're not sure if he had it with him at the time. Remember this name because it'll be brought up again. The interview then cuts to Ted Chirac again, and what he has to say about Thane Caesar. Chirac states that according to witnesses, Caesar pulled his gun as soon as he got up from the floor after the first few shots had been fired. According to Chirac, it was never established in any investigation whether Caesar was carrying the .38 or the .22, or whether or not he fired his gun. Kranz came back and retorted that he actually did interview Thane Caesar, and he told him that he was knocked down. He also told Kranz that he had been carrying his .38 that night, but that he never fired. And when asked why, he stated, "Because I was a coward." Security guard Thane Caesar went on to say that the LAPD and the FBI never even asked to interview him, even though he had been in the room when this important, super high-profile murder took place. He actually sought out the police thinking that they might want to speak with him since he had been in such close proximity to Kennedy when he died, and he had pretty much seen it all. Why were the police not interviewing everyone, and who else did they miss?
I didn't find any incredibly concrete evidence on this, but we did read a few articles that claim that Thane Caesar was not a fan of Robert Kennedy politically, and that he was a big supporter of a man named George Wallace. George Wallace was an Alabama governor who was constantly and very abrasively always speaking out against integration and yelling things like "segregation forever" into cheering crowds. He spoke out a lot against Robert Kennedy as well, and his influential speeches about bringing America together and supporting integration. A lot of people believe that it was Thane who fired the second gun. According to one of these articles, the police asked Thane about the .22 revolver that was registered to him that was similar to Sirhan's. Thane told the police that he'd sold it 2 months before the murder, and that, like we said, he was carrying his .38 that night. But apparently, it was later found that his story wasn't completely accurate. Thane had sold this .22 revolver, but he had actually sold it 3 months after the shooting of Robert Kennedy. Caesar was questioned for years after the shooting and continued to deny ever having fired his weapon at all, let alone at Kennedy. Apparently, Caesar even took a polygraph and passed with flying colors.
Now, another witness on scene did say that they did, in fact, witness Thane Caesar firing his weapon. The witness was a man named Don Schumann, and he was a messenger for a local news station. The information all came from Ted Chirac as well. When Krantz was asked about this, he stated that he interviewed Schumann as well and that Don Schumann's words were basically taken out of context. Schumann stated that he saw the guard pull his weapon, he saw Kennedy shot, and he saw blood, but he never actually said that he saw the guard fire the weapon. Now, Krantz did acknowledge that the initial statement on tape that was given by this witness did say that he thought Thane Caesar fired at Kennedy, but then later recanted this statement and attributed what he initially thought he saw to the fact that the scene was just so chaotic and he thought he got it wrong. The second statement is the one that the police used.
Another witness who was present, Dr. Marcus McBoom, stated during an interview that he saw a guy running from the pantry and he said that the man was carrying a gun and he seemed to be trying to hide it as he ran. Who was that guy? Who was this guy? And the question never really seems to be answered.
A few eyewitnesses at the Ambassador Hotel throughout the day and into the night stated that they had seen Sirhan present there. Many of them put him in the company of a woman who was wearing a polka dot dress. After the shooting happened, one of the Kennedy campaign workers by the name of Sandy Serrano was out on the balcony when she saw a woman in a polka dot dress running quickly out of the hotel pantry with another man. As they ran away from the hotel, the woman was shouting loudly, "We shot him! We shot him!" Serrano yelled, "Who?" And the girl yelled back, "Senator Kennedy." An LAPD officer named Paul Sharaga was told the exact same story by an elderly couple who were standing in the parking lot. The woman was described by all who saw her, and for the most part, all of the descriptions matched up. She was blonde, well-built girl with a crooked nose, wearing a white dress with black, possibly blue polka dots that were smaller than a dime. At that point, an APB was put out on the two of them. Supposedly more witnesses who knew Sirhan had even seen him in her presence in the weeks before the murder as well.
A few other witnesses came forward regarding the woman in the polka dot dress, according to the Mary Ferrell Foundation website in an article on the Robert Kennedy assassination. One happened on May 20th. On this day, Kennedy would be speaking in a lunchroom at Robbie's restaurant in Pomona, California. Sirhan and a young woman were seen together trying to get into the lunchroom and even trying to climb stair rails in order to do so. They state that this man was shown a series of 25 photographs of young, dark-skinned men and picked Sirhan out of all of them as the man trying to enter the lunchroom with a woman.
A couple of campaign workers, Laverne Botting and Ethel Crahan, also reported being asked for a copy of Robert Kennedy's schedule by two men and a woman. Could this have been Sirhan and the woman in the polka dot dress and the other man that she was seen fleeing the scene with?
A man named Dean Pack reported hiking in the mountain with his son at Santa Ana. They ran into two men and a woman shooting a pistol in the middle of nowhere who weren't very friendly, and they gave them a bad feeling. The people were hostile, and by the descriptions he gave, it sounded like one of the men was in fact Sirhan.
And then there was a man named Michael Wayne.
And then,
allegedly, supposedly, Wayne was in the room approximately 10 to 20 feet behind Sirhan when he started firing. It's said that Wayne was in the room under suspicious circumstances in the first place, as he had somehow obtained a press badge that he shouldn't have had. When the shooting started, it was said that Michael Wayne fled the scene, looking suspicious enough that he was tackled by police. When he was searched, a business card was found on him. The business card was for a man named Keith Gilbert. Oddly, Keith Gilbert was an alt-right extremist leader of the group called the Minutemen, who had been imprisoned for possession of stolen dynamite.
Michael Wayne denied being associated with the Minutemen. He denied knowing how he got the card or remembering ever even obtaining it. It's also of note that one of the LAPD officer's sisters was Gilbert's landlord, and it was her apartment in which the dynamite was found. That cop was interviewed and he admitted having contact with the militants of this far-right group. Even weirder, come to find out that when Gilbert's home was searched, a business card for Michael Wayne was found too. So why would he have been carrying this on this day? And why did they even have each other's cards if they didn't know each other? What is an alt-right group possibly doing at a Democratic campaign event? Why are the cops involved in this alt-right group? Is this why the LAPD did such a shoddy investigation job? There is some speculation there, but that's just one theory in a million. It seems that's as far as the evidence went.
Another interview done by Philip Melanson in 1987 with a man named Frank Burns was pretty interesting as well. Burns served as security for Robert Kennedy's campaign and was a direct eyewitness. He states that as Kennedy entered the pantry area, he kind of started running after him to redirect him because he felt like he was going the wrong way. Kennedy wasn't walking the way that they had planned for security purposes. He stated that he heard the noise first and then turned to see Sirhan being taken down and falling in a twisting pattern, firing toward Kennedy as he went down onto his back. When the first shots were fired, he felt that Sirhan was approximately 6 feet away from Kennedy at least, and he never got closer than a few feet away from Kennedy. Burns denied ever seeing any other guns drawn. He also denies ever seeing the famous girl in the polka dot dress. He states that he was in a rush even before the shots began to ring out, so he unfortunately didn't really notice much of anything else as far as details. He did state that the impression that he had of Sirhan was that he was almost passive. Quote, "In our struggle to subdue him, it wasn't that he was struggling to get away. It was that we were all almost pulling him in different directions. I don't remember him fighting or anything." The interviewer ended the tape speaking about a conversation that he and Frank Burns had as he was walking out the door. This part is about 3.5 minutes long, but we want to play it, so here it is.
Interview with Frank J. Burns, Jr., Robert F. Kennedy assassination witness. I've just finished interviewing Mr. Burns this morning at his office. We have a tape of that interview. It's about 50 minutes long. I wanted to put on the record what happened external to the tape.
What happened essentially is that after what I hope is a very good, detailed evidentiary recall of Mr. Burns, I was about to leave his office. We'd taken about an hour and 15 minutes to do that. Shook hands. It was all very pleasant. We're just about to the door where he's about to open it and show me out. And it's like something flashed through his head. You could see it, expression on his face. And he closed the door that he'd opened and started walking back toward his desk very purposefully. And he said, I don't want to be premature. I know you're just researching this, but you must have some opinions. What do you think about this case? What do you think about the evidence in this case? And he sat down behind his desk. And so I told him that I thought there were severe conflicts in the evidence that I was really concerned about, especially the one that he's centrally concerned about, which is distance versus autopsy, witness distance versus autopsy. And also I told him I was concerned about the extra bullets, and I went through extra bullets a little bit with him. I told him of William Bailey, and I told him of references in the FBI memos, and went through all that, and he seemed very concerned. It's kind of emotional look on his face. This was not easy. He'd spent the morning recalling, the trauma of this assassination, and it gone back and forth, both very animated and at times, you almost see emotion welling up. So we had this discussion, and he became very animated about it, and he said, look, that diagram was a little confusing. I don't think it looked, I'm not doubting it was to scale, but it looked confusing. He said, I want to show you something. I want to show you this. He said, I may be in doubt about how far north and how far south all of us were standing, in relationship. I may be in doubt about a couple of things, but what I'm not in doubt about is what I want to show you. And he mimed for me distance and angle. We just recreated the whole thing. He paced out an appropriate distance, and he said, here's where Sirhan was, here's where the gun arm was, here I was facing into it, I know, I saw it, and the senator was behind me, and he was just emphatic about it. He says, Sirhan was that far away, and I'm not in error, and it wasn't inches, and the gun never got to his head. Then it's almost as if he wanted to play devil's advocate, like he didn't want to seem like he was a conspiracy theorist or something. I said, I agreed with him. There was a real problem. He said, and he went into possible alternatives. He said that, Kennedy was twisting. Kennedy could have fallen back towards Sirhan to make up the problem with the distance. And then he stopped and said, of course, had he done that, I know about it because I was right there, and I know where he ended up, which probably means he didn't do that, on the floor, and I would have felt him doing that.
In March of 1977, special counsel to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, Thomas Kranz, finally did publish that report. In the report, first and foremost, Kranz denied any allegations that charges had been made within the report and that this was his work and his work alone. He went on to state his timeline and reasoning for the length of time that had passed from the start of his investigation to the report's issuance. Research regarding Bobby Kennedy's assassination had taken place from January of 1976 to March of 1976. From there, the report was being dictated from March to May. The report tapes were then sent to the Los Angeles DA's office to be typed. From there, the report had been reorganized and checked for errors of any kind and then prepared for final draft. The last process in which the preparation for the final draft took place over the course of approximately the next 7 months, because the DA's office had been experiencing cutbacks and were short-staffed on secretaries.
Basically, we read the report and it stands by the supposed evidence given and the testimony of the original investigators that there was no second gunman, there were only 8 bullets found at the scene, which would be consistent with Sirhan only having 8 bullets to fire, and that Sirhan acted alone in the murder of Senator Robert F. Kennedy.
In 2004, a Polish journalist came forward claiming to have audio recording from the pantry when RFK was killed. Handy. The journalist's name was Stanislaw Przynski. An audio analysis of the tape was done, and the final report of the analysis revealed that 13 shots were heard in a 5-second span on the audio, which is weird, since Sirhan's revolver only held 8 bullets, and there was no second gunman. But of course, this is only one analysis, and it's still up for debate, but interesting nonetheless.
So, if the RFK assassination was so cut and dry, what of all this other information that didn't really fit into their conclusion of the events? The eyewitnesses who saw other gunmen, reports of people hearing more shots fired than 8, the woman in the polka dot dress, and all of the other accounts that made the story sound a little weird. Well, if you go into the FBI FAIO vault and search up the report from the LAPD and the investigation files, you will find that these things are really just not there. They just didn't put those things in. The girls never came. There were reports of some of the witnesses being intimidated and questioned into retractions of their original statement. One of these people was Sandy Serrano. Remember, she was the woman on the balcony of the hotel that saw the man and woman running away yelling about how they shot Senator Kennedy. It said that she was called a liar, yelled at, accused of making things up and wanting attention for hours until she finally just said that she didn't see anything. The police then used the fact that she made the whole story up to say that the other witnesses didn't see those people either. Not that those witnesses ever actually retracted their statements. The LAPD just said that they were lying and put it in the report. Now, why would they do that? Simply because they didn't have an answer for who these people were. Or maybe because they were covering up the fact that they were ever there at all.
Sirhan Sirhan remains adamant that he has no recollection of the shooting or of writing any of the things that he wrote in the diary. There are a lot of theories that Sirhan Sirhan acted as some kind of alternate Manchurian candidate and that he was hypnotically programmed to do what he had done. This is why he has no memory of it and no memory of who would have conditioned him to do such a thing.
So why would these inconsistencies in the police reports and autopsies not have come out at the trial of Sirhan Sirhan? If he was never witnessed to have been behind RFK, yet those shots were fired from behind, wouldn't that right there tell a jury that he likely didn't fire the fatal shots? Why would they not talk about the polka dot dress girl and the man she was with? What about the fact that eyewitnesses don't put Sirhan close enough to RFK to have ever been able to shoot him at point-blank range, no more than an inch or two away from Kennedy's body, as the autopsy says?
You would think that it would be the defense team for Sirhan Sirhan that would be creating this pressure. But really, what would they have to gain from it? Sirhan had already said he was guilty. He was seen by numerous witnesses pulling out a gun and shooting RFK intentionally, and in the end, Robert Kennedy was dead. At this point, they were focused on getting him a lesser charge. They didn't really care about whether other people were there or not. They took the diminished capacity route with the trial. I'm not sure that it would have helped to try to figure out who these other people were and to press the second gun issue. What if they could have proven that he was influenced in some way to do this? Would it have made a difference? Maybe they just thought that it would be too hard to prove and their job was hard enough. It turns out, though, that the defense team didn't even really know about a lot of these things until it was way too far into the trial. So there's that.
You would also think that the pressure would come from the prosecution as well, because if they could find out who these other people were, they might be able to arrest them also and use them as witnesses. But again, given that Sirhan Sirhan was seen by everyone pulling the gun and shooting, and although he was claiming that he didn't remember the murder, he wasn't exactly denying it either. It was kind of a slam dunk case as it was. Why bring all the extra people in and muddle their case? The pressure wasn't coming from them. It was coming from conspiracy theorists. But also, it was in large coming from the press and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
In 2019, now 75-year-old Sirhan Sirhan survived a stabbing at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility near San Diego Prison, at which he remains housed. Apparently, officers got there pretty quickly and he remained in stable condition the entire time. Yes, folks, he's still alive. He was sentenced to death in 1969, but only a couple of years after that, California did away with the death penalty and his sentence was changed to life in prison. He's been denied parole every single time that he's been up for it for lack of remorse because to this day he still claims to have zero recollection of committing the crime.
Remember that earlier we spoke about a man named Paul Schrade? The speechwriter who was standing directly behind Kennedy and was shot in the forehead? He is 100% positive that Sirhan shot him in the head, but he is also sure that Sirhan was not the person who shot Robert Kennedy. Apparently, Paul Schrade showed up at Sirhan's parole hearing in 2016 advocating for the possibility of a second gunman and was met with very dismissive behavior from the parole panel. He left there feeling very frustrated, stating, quote, "I think you've been lost for a long time." In an interview, Schrade is quoting as saying, "Yes, Sirhan shot 4 other people and aimed at Kennedy. The important thing is, he did not shoot Robert Kennedy." Why didn't they go after the second gunman? They knew about him right away. They didn't want to know who he was. They wanted a quickie.
Don't we all?
I was going to say that.
Robert Kennedy's son, Robert Kennedy Jr., had gone on with his life, accepting that Sirhan had been the lone shooter in the death of his beloved father. In the last couple of years, though, he has been doing some investigating of his own after seeing his father's autopsy report. He saw this report and immediately felt that something wasn't right about the story that he had been told all along. It didn't seem consistent, and he became concerned that the wrong man could possibly have been convicted. He also states that he became even more convinced that there was more to the story after he himself began talking to his father's friend, Paul Schrade.
In the past few years, RFK Jr. has done quite a bit of research regarding his father's death. He states in an interview, quote, "My father was the chief law enforcement officer in this country. I think it would have disturbed him if someone was put in jail for a crime they didn't commit." He has even been to visit Sirhan in prison, although he hasn't disclosed the content of that conversation publicly. His sister Kathleen is said to have even jumped on board. She is quoted in a Washington Post article having said, "Bobby makes a compelling case. I think the investigation should be reopened."
RFK Jr. posted a statement on Instagram on September 12th of 2019 that said, quote, "On June 5th, 1968, Caesar, an employee in a classified section of the Lockheed's Burbank facility, was moonlighting as a security guard at the Ambassador Hotel. He had landed a job about 1 week earlier. Caesar waited in the pantry as my father spoke in the ballroom, and then grabbed my father by the elbow and guided him toward Sirhan. With 77 people in the pantry, every eyewitness said Sirhan was always in front of my father at a 3 to 6 foot distance. Sirhan fired 2 shots toward my father before he was tackled. From under the dog pile, Sirhan emptied his 8-chamber revolver, firing 6 more shots in the opposite direction, 5 of them striking bystanders and 1 going wild. By his own account, Caesar was directly behind my dad, holding his right elbow with his own gun drawn when my dad fell backwards on top of him. Caesar repeatedly changed his story about exactly when he drew his weapon. According to the coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, all 4 shots, and see, I don't know why he says that, because I read every time that RFK had been shot 3 times, but I don't know. So Dr. Thomas Noguchi said that all 4 shots that struck my father were contact shots fired from behind my dad with the barrel touching or nearly touching his body. As my dad fell, he reached back and tore off Caesar's clip-on tie. Caesar sold his .22 to a coworker weeks after the assassination, warning him that it had been used in a crime. Caesar lied to police, claiming that he had disposed of the gun months before the assassination. Caesar was a bigot who hated the Kennedys for their advocacy of civil rights for blacks. I had plans to meet Thane Eugene Caesar in the Philippines last June until he demanded payment of $25,000 through his agent Dan Moldea. Ironically, Moldea penned a meticulous and compelling indictment of Caesar in a 1995 book and then suddenly exculpated him by fiat in a bizarre and nonsensical final chapter. Kennedy Jr. concluded, "Police have never seriously investigated Caesar's role in my father's killing." Quite the post.
Interesting. As recently as 2011, Sirhan's lawyer spoke to the parole board, making an argument that Sirhan had been brainwashed into killing Bobby Kennedy. He claimed that Sirhan was manipulated and set up, even going so far as to say that he had certainly been hypnotized at the time of the killing and was pre-programmed into committing the murder. Other people who had been involved in the case, who are still around to argue that this had definitely been a premeditated and calculated act committed by terrorist Sirhan. But Sirhan, even under hypnosis and questioned, has always denied any memory of killing Kennedy. Under hypnosis, Sirhan said that he remembers being, quote, led into a dark place by a girl who wanted coffee and then being choked by an angry mob. There is a whole host of people, including prominent psychiatrists over the years, that speculate that Sirhan was hypnotically programmed assassin.
So basically, this was sold as an open and shut case, but as it turns out, there was so much evidence to the contrary. Eyewitnesses were basically ignored or dismissed without much cause. The other man and the other woman in the polka dot dress were never really even looked into. Per some pretty good experts, the ballistics don't match up to the scenario that Sirhan acted as the lone shooter. Ballistics evidence was lost and mishandled. Bobby Kennedy obviously had huge political differences with J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, anyone associated with communism, and was in a position to politically influence tons of people. There were plenty of people in high political power who did not want to see Robert Kennedy advance to the presidency, and these included people who would be capable of committing an assassination like this and making the investigation go their way. That being said, there was no shortage of high-stakes issues at hand either that would have made high people of power want RFK out of power. They had already been dealing with his brother, and he was looking to be just as much of a, quote, problem. His civil rights involvement and relationship with MLK, dealing with communist countries like Cuba and Russia, his advocacy against Vietnam, stances against the FBI, his hardcore and relentless investigations into the Teamsters Union and the mob, it never ends. There was an enormous amount of motive from every direction in this murder, and there's so much more reason to believe any number of these things played a huge part in his killing, even more so than one angry Palestinian man who didn't like his support for Israel being the only reason for his death.
The crazy amount of corruption in politics is unending and pretty savage. There's a reason why conspiracy theories emerge, and while there's a pile of people who love to use that term and make people who question the government seem crazy as hell, one look into the FBI files that have been declassified and the CIA files that have been declassified really make a person acutely aware that things that are deemed conspiratorial are not so far-fetched.
Forgive us for jumping around so much in this episode. We didn't even begin to cover everything here. There was such an enormous amount of documents to go through. We really had to cherry pick the information in order to keep this episode at a listenable length. Again, I am sorry for my horrid voice. I am sick. We do hope, though, that you enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll stay tuned because we've got a couple more coming in the next few weeks about the Kennedys, and a lot of this information ties in together. While it's hard to say who may have been responsible ultimately for the killing of Bobby Kennedy, there's enough to definitely make a person question whether or not Sirhan Sirhan acted alone, and question whether or not he was put up to it by someone much, much more powerful and influential than he was. Don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from, and please leave a rating and a review because we love hearing from you.
And remember, Soylent Green is people. It's people.
Come at me, bro.